So, for some reason, I was drawn to talking tonight about surrendering to mistakes and kind of as a subtopic, surrendering to judgments or surrendering our judgments rather than surrendering to them. I guess that's a little different, isn't it? So, and in the category of mistakes, again, mistake itself, the word itself is almost a judgment, right? But perhaps we can also include in that, um, the things that you might regret doing. And of course, once they're done, whatever that is. And so the time to begin surrender is the moment after they're done, um, because there's choices in the middle of them, perhaps to change course. Um, so, when I think of this, I want to start with simple things, not the things that you necessarily most carry in your heart that you wish weren't something that you had experienced or you had caused someone else to experience. But just start with something very simple like forgetting. Forgetting is a really common mistake. And it exposes our humanness and just the way that our brain just sometimes doesn't do that function for whatever reason. I was recalling, this happened a number of years ago, but I forgot to show up at the wedding of a friend of mine, and of course I was mortified when I found out. But I kind of understood why. There's something in me that's kind of fortified against forgetting. I have little anxiety bookmarks all over my mind of things that have to be shown up for. Certainly this class has a little anxiety bookmark. It's kind of unlikely that I'm going to just not show up, as you can imagine when you're in charge of something like this. And it's like your mind puts a little red line on something in there that activates it, and then something kind of holds on to that. And so what I've found over the years is sometimes relaxing is the friend of forgetting. And it so happened that the wedding was happening in the summer, and I was at a lake cabin with my family and some friends. And it was like I was supposed to have gotten up on Saturday and taken off. And I just got up on Saturday and went with the flow, and people sitting around and drinking coffee and talking and so forth and so on. It was like gone. And so there you are. When What do we surrender to? It's not so much, I mean, these things just happen. There's no surrendering to them, they just happen. Um, but what I find follows in the wake of something like this is a certain amount of like mental pain of regret. And I find it helpful to kind of, when I notice it, to feel into two different types of mental pain that sometimes a mistake can cause, like just forgetting something that's very important, that has some consequences for people. And so there's feeling bad about myself on one side, and there's feelings that I have about the impact on the other person on the other side. Okay. And I think it's important to distinguish those two because they tend to get kind of confused in a certain way, where what I feel badly about perhaps is my own fallibility, my own embarrassment. Um, and so sometimes it's helpful to like take the, you know, I don't know why I'm thinking of an arm on a record player, take that kind of arm of the off that particular record of what does it mean about me and my inadequacy, my, whatever the story is, and to turn the focus on, well, what does it mean for the other people and what can be done about that? And so there's a kind of a surrender to that, even though we're talking about doing. Surrender is the ally of doing in many cases. And sometimes we can't see what there is to be done for the consequences of our actions because we're kind of wrapped up in this other thing. And so, I called immediately. And of course, this was actually before my friend had a cell phone. So it just went on the recorder in their house where I knew they weren't there, and apologized profusely and said what happened. And there wasn't any way to get a hold of him right that day necessarily. And and I don't know there was anything to make up that I could do to make up for it. So this isn't the worst mistake of my life, but it's just that, something that kind of comes up on the radar when I think of mistakes. There's also kind of what you say that you wish you hadn't, right? Which is often goes along with losing your temper, getting angry, being triggered. And so again, I mean, this is like true of everything, every example that I'm going to give. Things arise according to causes and conditions. If I've learned anything from Buddhism, it's this, and it's absolutely golden, this phrase, causes and conditions. So, my forgetting arose due to causes and conditions. If you lose your temper, there are causes and conditions to that. There's some pain that got touched inside of you that flared up and took over, and then some very protective part maybe got a hold of your voice and launched into an attack. And the notion of causes and conditions is helpful because it takes some of the sting out of the situation. It takes some of the taking it personally out of it. If you can begin to see that this is what the mind does, this is what the mind does when it's angry. It blames. Have you ever noticed, in the moment that this sort of anger is touched, your mind is so quickly to see the faults in someone else and their contribution to the situation. It's just like written there in kind of red letters for you to see. And then afterwards, when that sort of adrenal charge has dissipated and something shifts, then you see differently. You're no longer in that sort of triggered state. And you see the unfairness of what you said. You perhaps see your own contribution to the situation. Suddenly the mind can see that again. But it was blind in that moment. It was blind in that moment. And then there's kind of the cause and condition of habit, because sometimes people are more in the habit of this than others. There may be a few individuals for whom losing their temper might actually be a movement in the right direction. Few individuals, maybe not most, but some people, might need that go to speak up where they don't habitually in themselves. But given that that's probably not most of us, there's this sort of blindness that comes over. And I've always loved one of the Buddhist words for this is shamelessness. It's like suddenly your shame disappears. And suddenly what is most important is to like attack or defend yourself or whatever. And whatever social safeguards kept you kind of in place are gone. And things come out of your mouth. So again, that distinction between what is the feeling bad, which is like, oh, I'm a bad person, to sort of reflect what it means about you, pain, and like what damage did your words actually cause to the other person, to the relationship, to the way that trust and safety was violated. Those are very important to distinguish. And then what can be done? What can be done to restore safety and trust? Usually, if you've injured somebody with words, you got to use words to try to repair the situation. And you have to be willing to listen to what hurt, which is often stirs up this other side, like I'm a bad person, to actually let somebody have the chance to tell you what hurt or what the impact of your words was, and to actually receive it. You have to surrender again to acknowledging what you did, acknowledging it and witnessing, and then finding whatever kind of appropriate way there is to redress that, if it's possible to repair that. Okay. So all along, it's not as if surrender is without action, but there are these ways that sometimes you have to bow and say, oh, yes, I did that. And oh, yes, it had this consequence. And I see that it touched you in this way and caused pain. Sometimes you can do something that another person goes ouch about, that you're not actually responsible for their pain. You're just, say, honest. You just stumbled into something, some owie that they had, some wound you didn't know about, and it exploded in front of you, you know? And so sometimes, and this again, sometimes what you surrender is this false sense of being the cause of something. Like if somebody gets upset at what I said, it must have been because I did something wrong. This is a very old, young, if I can put it that way, very young kind of place in us that feels like another person's reaction is the determinant of our goodness and badness, and the goodness and badness of what we said, and so forth. And I'm a sort of person that I like to be kind. But I also like to please, which is not the same thing. I like to have people happy with me, and so once in a while, it's important to say something that someone's not going to be happy about. and they might, have some harsh things to say towards you. Um, and so there can be a surrender there as well to letting someone else think badly of you. Whoa, yeah, let somebody else have a negative judgment about you in that moment or forever. You know, it's a powerful thing, this kind of surrender. And it gets confusing. I mean, human relationships are so confusing. They're so complex. And, we can come into them with the intention to take responsibility for what's ours and to not take responsibility for what's not ours. But goodness, it can get confusing in the midst of all of that to determine what is what. Um, so one of the things that my mind goes to in this is the illusion that we often carry that we know how things should be. We know how I should be, and we know how someone else should be. Again, go back to causes and conditions. If you're shitting on yourself, do you know actually all the causes and conditions at work inside of you at any given moment? I bet you don't. I certainly don't. I don't know all the causes and conditions going at any moment and why they come together once in a while to have something go wrong where I misinterpret a situation, for example. Maybe it was just ignorance. Or maybe there was some laziness on my part that I hadn't actually looked into that I should have ahead of time. Maybe there was something I didn't foresee, which could have been, again, just ignorance. But maybe I've been neglecting something. I know many people also live with, should I say, regrets about things they've done in um, states that weren't sober, whatever the whatever the thing was. And there's a responsibility there. And yet there are also causes and conditions. And so, the reason why people may be using a substance is a kind of a mixture and in a way that's often hard to parse out. And sometimes you need somebody else with you to parse it out about, how the pain that you don't know how to deal with is involved and how the running away from the pain is involved and, so forth and so on. Or sometimes, I mean, I mentioned procrastination. I can't remember if it was in the last class or the one before, but sometimes there are pretty severe consequences when you put things off and you put things off. Whether it's water leaking in somewhere, causing some serious damage on a physical level, or it's just kind of not noticing your behavior in some important way with the people that are around you. So all of this, I mean, this is just the territory of being human. Being human is very humbling. Being close to anyone is very humbling because they mirror back to you things that you're unconscious about. And over, I think it requires surrendering. And it's complicated because nobody's a perfect mirror in a relationship. What somebody's telling you about yourself is not necessarily truth, but neither is what your head is telling you about yourself is truth, is it? So somewhere in there, we kind of walk this line, and there are moments where we just have to like bow to, and the moments when this goes the best is when I can kind of say, okay, my job right now is to listen to what you're telling me I did wrong. My job right now is to listen to what you're telling me about how you felt about that or what its consequence was for you and so forth. My job right now is to listen and to let you know that I've heard it and that I've got it straight. And later, I can figure out what there is to own about it. So this is another distinction that took me most of my lifetime to learn. But, the way things tend to go awry is that I start thinking about this the minute somebody starts telling me. And then pretty soon I say, no, that's not right. And I stop listening and, things go back and forth. So surrender is often to surrender your own urge to defend yourself and to figure out whether somebody's being accurate or just, and just listen. It's hard thing to do. And to acknowledge what they've said and acknowledge the pain that's in it, which is also challenging sometimes because people don't want to acknowledge the pain in it. They want to tell you what's wrong with you, right? That's hard. So if you can acknowledge what they're saying and go for what the pain is, it takes a lot of surrender of the urge to defend, a lot of surrender of the wanting someone to think well of you or worrying about, what they've said and what that means. It's just like to surrender to, okay, someone's telling me about their inner experience right now, their inner experience of me. I need to listen. And I need to repeat enough of it back and, to let them know that I get what they're saying. And that actually doesn't mean that I agree to all of it or it's all fair or whatever, set that aside, surrender that to later. Believe me, this is so hard. And then later, kind of figure out what's valid there that is actually a mistake, if mistake's even the right word. And what do I actually need to say that maybe not is not that? So all of these things is involved in this sort of practice. So in the face of someone else who knows how you should be, this is the practice. But what about the face of what you think someone else should be? You might have to surrender telling them for a moment until you're clear about what the pain is inside of you that's motivating you to come at them with that judgment. What is it actually that is touching in you? And it helps if you can surrender the notion that you know how they should be, or you know how things should go. sometimes this happens on just a ridiculously small level. Um, my wife and I were kind of joking the other day about, what's hard about living with each other. And she says it's hard that I don't close the cupboards in the kitchen. And I, and I say, it's because you don't close the door to the between the kitchen and the mudroom, which is not heated, and so all the heat goes out. So we each have our own little, thing, and I could probably list, 10 more on each side of these. These are sort of things of living with each other, and we could joke about it only because there was surrender there. That there isn't some absolute standard of how people should live. Um, there may be some that I would be willing to sign off to. There is a level of uncleanliness that becomes hazardous and that I certainly couldn't live with and that might be unhealthy. So on the cleanliness scale, yeah, there's probably some places that most of us would sign off. This isn't acceptable. You know, I love a clean, tidy place, but I'm not the guy to keep it that way. I'm really not. And so I also don't think I could live with perfection if that was expected of me. So somewhere in between. And mostly it's about this human thing. If you're involved, if you're actually living with someone, if you're not living with someone, you, whatever, there isn't quite the same onus. But over and over, it's so helpful if you can surrender the thought, I know how things should be. And to speak instead from, it's hard for me when, and say why. What's hard about the cupboards being left open? You know, what's hard about the kitchen door being left open? So forth. Now, perhaps some of the hardest regrets, I think, can be around, this sort of backward looking gaze at one's life, when you can see the choice points. And particularly like when you feel you've injured someone over time by the way you've been, injured someone you love, you care about by how you've been, or you've injured yourself with some poor choices, or choices that were seen as poor, at least later on. Um, there's a lot of surrender to do there. There's a lot of grief work to do there. There's a lot of getting clear about, again, this distinction between the I'm bad or what this means about me or the pain of the damage to my own self-image versus what's actually real out there in the world in that person walking around. Just waiting for the next thing to drop in. Surrendering pride, and I use that word rather broadly, And that's what this represents in a certain way. Pride maybe is one word. Another word I'd have to put for this is fear. There's fear involved in I'm not acceptable. I'm not okay. I'm not lovable. So I don't want to dismiss this thing that goes on the mind around mistakes, social kinds of, things that happen, because it's very real, because we're social animals and it matters to us how we, fare in the world in relationship to others. Mm. It feels like there's something I want to say there. Have you ever had this experience where you can't quite say it? It's like I'm like reaching for how to say what self-love looks like in this domain, of feeling bad about yourself. One of the things that occurs to me to say, it's something I've been working with, is it's kind of has come up with this kind of concrete sense of me at about 6 years old. That's the easiest way I can say it. And the sense of the innocence of my being, and it doesn't have so much to do with age, but somehow as we grow older, we keep blaming ourselves more and more, feel like we should be more responsible, we should be something. And so sometimes I come back to the sense of innocence of this being that I am. And I have access to it in a way that I didn't when I was younger. The sense of who's innocent here. And it's not kind of like writing off responsibility the way some people might imagine. It's rather just not beating up on myself, being able to drop the parts of the mind that start getting down on me. And believe me, they're in there. I wish I could bottle it. I wish I could give people a dose sometimes of this sense. I mean, I talk about it sometimes as okayness, but this sense of when people say it this way, and I just really think it's true, we're all doing the best we can. Even the people who are really not looking so good, doing the best, we're doing the best we can. Causes and conditions. And you invest over time in things like these classes, for example, are an example of, people want to learn and become more skillful. And of course, that kind of builds up a certain ability in the midst of all of this. That's very helpful. But in this class on surrender, I also want to say, and shit's going to happen, even if you're skillful, even if you, have done all sorts of things, mistakes happen. A phrase, has come to me recently that love loves imperfection and failure. I somehow like it. It it kind of lifts the burden off these things for me. The unlovability aspect of them, which is this side of it. And if I can lift the I'm unlovable side of it, I'm so much better at this other side of it, which is like, what is the actual acknowledgement and repair and redress for the consequences? I'm so much clearer about what those are if I'm not admired in this. If I can give myself the love that it takes to absorb this and digest this and not be so stuck in it in order to be available for this.